Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV WORLD in a special show with regards to the 48th session of the foreign ministers of the OIC countries that is being held in Islamabad today and tomorrow. We've earlier discussed this as well in our 7 p.m. show as well, and there are a number of issues that still remain to be talked about. Of course, this is an important initiative by Pakistan that has taken place today and will continue tomorrow as well with regards to the evolving situation around the world and the kind of issues that are going to come under discussion. This is in a special session that is going to hold utmost importance for not only Pakistan but other countries in the region and in the world as well. Issues such as Afghanistan, Islamophobia, Kashmir, Palestine, a number of others that affect the Muslim population around the world will be under discussion during these 2 days. A lot of it also, of course, depends on what really is going to be the outcome of this session and what sort of change can we hope for and expect with reference to the actual issues and the sufferings of the people in all of these conflict zones and other parts of the world as well. Earlier in our show, we talked about the OIC as a body as well and how we can also strengthen and reinforce its procedures and its actions in terms of actually helping the people around the world. And so a lot of our discussion in today's segment as well is going to focus upon the OIC and its contributions and the role that it has played in the past and continue to do so, and with specific reference to the issues highlighted before, what really can be done in terms of actual change and action. For this and more, I have been joined in the studios as always, of course, by Farrukh, Pitafi and Faisal. And we've also been joined online by our guests, Professor Ismail Sari, who's the ORSEM Center for Middle East Studies. We've also been joined by Professor Adil Najm, who's a Dean at Boston University. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. I hope, Professor Ismail, that I pronounced your name correctly. If not, forgive me if I didn't. When we talk about the OIC in general, and of course this special session that is being hosted by Pakistan, a lot of it is at stake in terms of what is being experienced by Muslims around the world in different parts where we've seen a lot of suffering. And there are a number of issues that are important to stakeholders as part of the OIC and what really needs to be done. Professor Ismail, when we talk about the Islamic countries and the Muslim countries in general and the ones that constitute the OIC and such sessions that have happened in the past as well, what sort of efforts and outcomes do you expect to be there or should be there when we see the conclusion of this 2-day session in terms of helping the people who are under atrocities or under occupation or in conflict zones? What sort of actions or changes can the OIC as a body make for them with reference to helping them and facilitating them?
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Today, Pakistan is hosting crucial OIC meeting here to discuss topics on Afghanistan, Kashmir, Palestinian, and Islamophobia. Regarding the meeting's agenda, it will encompass everything that is of interest to Muslim world, with this year's theme Partnership for Unity, Justice, and Development. But especially Palestinian will be discussed, Kashmir, and other important issues. Afghanistan will be a very significant part of the extensive agenda of the meeting. The event will highlight the unity of Muslim Ummah in the face of very serious challenges facing the world. OIC criticized for its inability to resolve various problems. Imagine if OIC was not speaking on the Palestinian and Kashmir issue, one will see that the picture immediately changed. So sometimes, unfortunately, OIC comes in for a bit of criticism on account of its perceived inability to solve various problems. But most important, what the OIC does is to lend a voice to this issue and to keep them alive, to highlight
All right,
them.
Professor Ismail, we'll
The
discuss all of
important
these
goal
issues at
to
length
look
as
at
well
the
as we continue
issue.
our discussion. Professor Adil, as a whole, what do you think this particular session, in terms of its significance and importance, does it hold in terms of perhaps the issues that are being discussed or the actual stances or actions that are going to be taken, if so, after the conclusion? Is there anything that you deem special or different about this particular session than the number that have passed before?
So, these meetings are always important at some level, but let us also remember this is the 48th meeting of the OIC. The OIC has had its own challenges throughout its existence, but there is significance. There is certainly significance for Pakistan. As the host, I think it is very important for Pakistan Foreign Affairs, that Pakistan is able to host such a large gathering. And that, I think, is important itself for Pakistan, whether it is for OIC or not, because it is another attempt to reassert the leadership and importance that Pakistan has had at various points in history, not only within OIC but within larger international affairs, and particularly as someone who speaks, as a country that speaks for Muslim countries in general or speaks for developing countries. So that is a mantle that I think had been somewhat reduced in its efficacy over the years. And the significance for Pakistan is simply that it is hosting it and is therefore reasserting this role. I think the significance for Pakistan and maybe the OIC is also that there is something on the agenda in terms of Islamophobia, which the current Prime Minister of Pakistan has taken on as a cause, and to see if we can generate greater interest in it, not just verbal interest, but serious political interest in that as an issue to highlight at the global level. Now, if that comes from the OIC, that will have significance because this is the body of a very large number of Muslim countries and with very, very large populations of Muslims. And finally, and I think probably most importantly, the significance, if there is one, is in the timing. And the timing not in relation to OIC, but what is happening in the world. And that means certainly Ukraine, but much more importantly, Afghanistan. And this again comes at the heel of another meeting that Pakistan had hosted on Afghanistan. And we've in some ways seen how quickly the half-life of Afghanistan, it's kind of just vanished from the screens internationally. And therefore, this is an important opportunity to highlight the importance of not just that issue, but a whole host of other issues. We are in a moment of transition in global geopolitics. We are in a moment of redefinition in global geopolitics. But, and lastly and importantly, we are also in a moment of very significant divisions and frictions within the Muslim world. And
right, Dr. Najib, I'm so glad that you actually spoke about timing. Timing is all very important. Tomorrow is Pakistan Day, and there's going to be a parade, and most of these guests are going to be guests of honor there. Recently, India also held its Republic Day parade, and there wasn't any foreign guest at all. India has been talking about isolating Pakistan. It seems that in the end, it is India that seems to be isolating itself rather than Pakistan, sir.
It's too early to say. I think India has some very significant problems, the biggest one of which is Mr. Modi and his politics, which is now causing serious challenges to Indian foreign policy as it has been defined. And in many ways, however, I would, Farrukh, politely suggest that the significance to Pakistan of OIC is much greater than India. That even though the Republic Day and the Pakistan Day come next to each other, that is a much less important thing for me as a Pakistani than the fact that Pakistan will be seen sort of hosting a major gathering of Muslim leaders. Now, when your show started, you showed this song, Mustafa Vi Hain, which for many of us of my age and my generation brings back memories of the OIC summit that was held in Lahore back in the 1970s. And that was in many ways a peak of not just Pakistan foreign policy with the Muslim world, but also a peak of the OIC. So in some ways, to me, that is the mantle that from a Pakistan foreign policy perspective is much more important. But you're right, India has very significant challenges in its foreign policy, the biggest of which is Mr. Modi itself, but also in the Ukraine crisis and how the lines that had been drawn seem now to be wavering, both in terms of India-US relations and in terms of India-Russia relations. But my focus really would be much more on Pakistan foreign policy and what this moment means for that,
Sure.
which is much bigger than what India is.
Professor Ismail, if we look at the Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech, of course he mentioned early on while his speech was going on, and he said as an organization, OIC has been not performing in terms of not delivering to people of Palestine and people of Kashmir, and he categorically said that of course we know that there are certain Muslim countries that has their own foreign policy preferences. Did he mean that of course there are many countries that are having very good relations with with Israel as well, and then there are countries that are having trade and good relations with India as well, likes of Iran? And I just wanted to know, is this the case, or Prime Minister Imran Khan was highlighting something else?
Yes. The Muslim world today has many problems, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Kashmir, Palestinian. The Muslim world needs unity, like Turkey and Pakistan, like Pakistan and Azerbaijan. Pakistan supports the solution of the problems of the Muslim world. There is important point that Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan on today told phoned the OIC and China to step in the and meditate between Russia and Ukraine to stop the ongoing war. Imran Khan said we are all worried about what is going on there. Imran Khan is not only concerned with the problems of Muslim world, but also with the problems of the whole world. We are seeing the rise of Pakistan diplomacy. Thank you for Pakistan, people of Pakistan. Thank you for Imran Khan for peace.
Right. Professor Adil, earlier you were talking about frictions and divisions as part of the Muslim world as well. And that's important because when we talk about the OIC and particularly this session, the theme also centers around building partnerships with regards to justice, development and unity. And it is important in issues such as Islamophobia as well or any other for the OIC countries to be at least aligned with regards to their response to that issue. Is that something that is too much to ask for from the OIC as a body? When we talk about these issues, of course, we need that for action.
I don't know if it's too much to ask for, but I think it's worth asking for. Even if it is too much to ask for, I think it is something that should be pushed on. If you look at the history of the OIC, its important moments, and there have been too few of them, its important moments have always been about what it does to bring the Muslim countries together, rather than moments when it has been able to assert influence abroad. OIC does not have a history of being able to change world opinion, but whenever it has been effective by creating a force within the Islamic world, if you will, within the Muslim countries, if you will, of unity on some issues. That happened with the oil crisis, that happened certainly with the Lahore summit, that happened, for example, with the return of Egypt into the OIC after it was removed from the OIC when it acknowledged Israel as a country during Mr. Anwar Sadat's moments. And this is an important moment for that too. I do think the issue of Islamophobia is an important one. It's a new one. It relates to what has happened in the last 2 decades, and therefore I think it has lots of political power globally. But the issues internally are also very important. including, for example, let's take Palestine, the question that was asked by Faisal Saab about Israel. If you look at the countries that are represented, they have a very wide range of views on Israel.
Exactly.
Now, they might suggest that they have a unitary view on Palestine, but some look at support as to Palestine meaning not talking to Israel. Others believe that you can support Palestinian cause while also having relations with Israel. So this is a question that the Muslim world has to sort of tackle with. I do not know what the right answer is, but this is not an easy debate to have.
Right,
I think
and that is,
value of
Dr.
bodies
Saab,
like
that is
OIC
also
is
true
to
for
have that debate.
what is happening in India as well. We saw that UAE's business delegation actually went to invest in Kashmir.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, there is a reason why we keep bringing up Islamophobia. Especially, I'm talking to a very accomplished, academician like you, sir. Let me ask you about this term and how to actually further work on it. Because I have seen that the UN has actually approved, passed that resolution. But is it not Muslim countries' job to actually ensure that as an academic construct, it actually works and it is passed and it is given some kind of life of its own so that we can know how to tell Islamophobia from other phobias and how to deconstruct it, how to fight it, sir?
I think you're 100% correct, 100% correct, Farrukh. And including on the India point that I think in many ways the more important point for OIC to raise, not the more important, the equally important point for OIC to raise is what is happening to minorities, particularly Muslim minorities within India. And that is a concern that adds to the long-standing concern on Kashmir in many ways. I think you're 100% right that the onus of defining what this means, in some ways the UN resolution was accepted very easily because at this point it's words. And who can be against intolerance? But to put meaning into what it means, to put meaning into what Islamophobia is, but also to put meaning into what does it mean to act against it. What type of policies are required in other countries to act against it. That can be not just an intellectual, but a policy exercise in which Muslim countries have to lead. Now, allow me to say also that how do we lead in that? We will lead in that by the examples we will set ourselves of tolerance for other communities within Muslim countries. Right. Because that will also strengthen our ability to proclaim and claim.
Right, and that makes sense. But
to
Professor Ismail, with regards to the kind of response perhaps that is required with reference to Islamophobia, we keep hearing about a global campaign against Islamophobia and a unified stance against it. And for the same reason, we of course require the Muslim countries to get together and be able to formulate that strategy. Is that something that you think is a necessity in the way that different countries are going to deal with Islamophobia, or perhaps each of us can have their own set of responses as to how to deal within their own countries as well? Because when we talk about a global campaign, I just want to understand whether or not it's going to be a prerequisite for the Muslim countries to actually come to an understanding as to what sort of consequences need to be in place.
With your permission, Sanal, let me add to this question. Professor, since we are talking about Islamophobia, it seems to me that many countries are talking about it, and there are various concerns which might not be exclusive to each other, but which actually take you in different directions. For example, one is about symbolism and value system. The other is about human rights of Muslims all over the world. And once you actually work on a broader Big Ten definition of Islamophobia, then you will need to actually focus on every layer, every nuance of it. Do you think that Muslim countries have that kind of academic juice to address all these issues, sir? Dr. Ismail.
Professor Ismail?
We can't hear him.
Professor Ismail, we are unfortunately not able to hear you. Can you please unmute your mic?
Yeah.
Right. There seems to be some technical problem.
No.
Professor Ismail, unfortunately, we still are not able to hear you. Are you sure your mic is not muted? All right, let us come back to you, Professor Ismail. Perhaps, Professor Adil, you can take this question for now.
Certainly, I mean, I think the gravity of the challenge is there, but also the gravity of dealing with it that was embedded in the question is there, meaning that it's not going to be easy. Islamophobia at one level is an easy term to define because you can see it when you see it. At the other level, if you're talking really about policies, about response, about those layers of different meaning and different contexts that exist in different parts of the world, that will take a lot of intellectual and policy effort. And in I think the thing to build on is that we have seen that for other types of, whether it is hate speech, other types of intolerance, the world has come to accepted norms of what is clearly not allowed. And unfortunately, the latitude that is given to the type of hatred that can be sometimes targeted at Muslims is so great that we have to take the onus. By we, I mean the Muslim countries and Muslim intellectuals themselves, to start defining what are those lines, even despite all the differences. What are the lines where hate is clearly hate?
Yeah, Professor Adil, a different question. We had Foreign Minister of China in Pakistan and attending this OIC conference as a special guest of it. And we know, and he himself highlighted it as well, that continuously he always stood with, stood by Pakistan whenever it comes to Kashmir. If we talk about Ukraine, they are trying to play their role, and they have offered their role as well to both Ukraine as well as Russia. And right now, sitting in OIC, I just wanted to know, you sitting in Boston University, how do you see it? Where China is heading? Is it that China is becoming not only a major regional player, but the world player right now?
I think clearly China has become, not becoming, but has become a world player. And China is now also acting like a world player. I think one of the many changes COVID brought was that it fast forwarded China's own aggressiveness in being seen as a world player. And in some ways, they were keeping a lower profile, and suddenly world affairs has forced them to take on a greater profile. You're exactly right. We have representation from China at the highest level, meaning foreign minister. We also have representation from the US, not at the have. But you see China now speaking with a global viewpoint and creating its own spheres of influence, if you will. And certainly Pakistan is an important part of that. But if you think about China's foreign policy, they also see not just that Pakistan is here, but a number of other countries that are at OIC are also of importance to them. And I think in that shifting geopolitical scenario, China, from my viewpoint, is no longer becoming, but has become a world player who cannot be ignored.
All right, Professor Ismail, can you hear me?
No, I think
unfortunately,
he can hear us.
He can hear us, but unfortunately, we still can't hear you. We're going to try our best to fix the problem as well, and hopefully you'll be able to do something at your end as well. We'll come back to you, Professor Ismail. But Farrukh, in the meantime, when we're talking about, of course, the importance that China holds as well, earlier we also talked about the Ukrainian crisis, and Professor Adil was mentioning, of course, that the timing and the way the world is evolving is also important with regards to this session. And Prime Minister Imran Khan also said something with regards to Ukraine and the OIC countries actually being able to do something about it. What exactly can the OIC countries do with regards to the Ukrainian crisis?
Right. First of all, Sana, I think it is a very important question, and I think we should be addressing it. See, every crisis actually brings up two kind of responses. One is emotive, right? You want the suffering to end. The other one is more selfish, and that is preserving your own interest. First of all, you have to look at what exactly are we going through, right? Oil prices are rising. Food prices are also, there is inflation. We are talking about, Russia, which is a major producer of oil, but then so are the OIC countries, many of which were present here. And then, of course, there are concerns about other things as well, like food. There are many Muslim countries which are producing a lot of food and grain as well. So all these concerns can be addressed in coming days, and there seems to be some lighting problem as well as we speak. Please go ahead.
And it's come back as
Yeah.
you said it.
Yes.
So you're blessed.
Should I finish the point now that light is
Right.
back?
And Sana,
Yes.
I'll add something.
Yeah,
to this.
allow me to just finish the thought, because I thought that I should yield earlier because perhaps I shouldn't stay in the dark. But regarding what I was saying, at this moment it is very important for all these countries to first come up with a comprehensive solution to their own problems. Remember that many African and Arab countries are highly dependent on grain that is imported from Russia. What happens if this time it is not going to be in market? It is going to be expensive, and then in sub-Saharan Africa you have the problem with droughts as well. So we'll have to come up with some very concrete policy solutions. I hope that OIC can provide that, because first you preserve yourself, then you go for solving problems in somebody else's neck
Right,
of the
makes
woods.
sense. Yes,
Yeah.
Faisal.
Yeah, Sana, I just wanted to further highlight, obviously, Dr. Adil's point. Of course, China is becoming as a key player, and if we look at in the region, of course, with Pakistan, it has strengthened further and further for certain reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, India, because there is a standoff between both of the countries, and we know that 14 table talks between both of the sides, they were failed, and the solution is not coming to them in the Eastern Ladakh. That is one of the problems. But there is another one, that right now we are seeing that Pakistan has really worked really hard with China to bring them on in the OIC as a special guest. And we know that they are having good relations with Iran as well, with the African Muslim countries as well, and right now with the Middle Eastern countries as well. Especially recently, they have successfully talked with Saudi Arabia on having oil trade not in dollars but yuan, which would be considered as one of the very important things for Chinese economy. So all of these things are obviously very good for China, and China believes that Pakistan has its own role to play when it comes to the Muslim countries. So I see as both of the countries, China and Pakistan, getting their relations with each other to a level that would be undeterred in the future.
And with your permission, I would like to further add on this as well, Sana,
Yes.
because now we are clearly talking about China, not Ukraine. So regarding China, I must say one thing very clearly. I mean, I can rationalize many relations, I can comment on many relations. But when it comes to China, China is such a good friend of Pakistan, and Pakistan has been such a good friend of China, that my mind is incapable of rational thought on this relationship, right? What exactly do they get? What do we get? I don't care. We have worked together, and this is a relationship which is astounding, mind-boggling actually. Pakistan has always supported China, right from getting the veto at the UN or getting membership to getting a good relationship with America as well, right? And even today, it was one more step in that direction. But at this moment, while China does what it does, it is important for Muslim countries to also exercise their own agency, especially when it comes to OPEC. Remember, OPEC is a major cartel which actually decides oil prices because it produces them, right? The problem at this moment is the kind of prices we have can have a major impact on how we are trading with the world. And that becomes a concern, because in coming days it can really wreak havoc with many of the Muslim countries. So OPEC and how actually it works within the framework of OIC is important. I think we should be pushing for that. Our Saudi brothers, our UAE brothers, they can do a lot. perhaps Iran as well.
Right, but the issue of agency that you've pointed out, Farrukh, do these Muslim countries even have their own agency in terms of actually exercising them? Like, are they even going to be able to do that?
Why not? I mean, I'm living in a country that has suffered economic problems for quite some time. But this is a country which is fiercely trying to assert its foreign policy, which is hosting 57 countries of the world as we speak. So there is agency and we can always exercise it. I don't think that this whole idea that somehow Muslim leadership has compromised is correct. I think that we can do it, but we have to realize that united we stand, divided we fall.
Exactly. So does that hold true for all of the countries that we're talking about? Perhaps all of the countries are part of the OIC.
Oh, which countries are you particularly talking about? Identify them and I can tell you that their interest also lies within this framework.
Right. Right. Yeah. And this, of course, points to the larger question as well that I wanted to ask Professor Adil, but I'm assuming that he's not with us at this moment. So, Faisal, when we talk about the individual countries as well and the OIC as a body, we also understand that there are limitations to an intergovernmental organization or to bodies in general as well. And perhaps a lot of their actual power and capabilities lie on the individual countries and the powerful countries within that organizations as well. So, when we talk about a lot of these issues, such as Afghanistan, or Kashmir or Palestine or Islamophobia, then how do we see the individual countries and their own interests and their own foreign policies coincide with what perhaps the OIC as a body wants to be able to move forward? Professor Adil is with us, so why don't you take the question, Professor Adil? When we talk about the individual countries and the way their own stances are with reference to other countries and their relations, perhaps relations with India, how do we see moving forward the stance that is going to come out from the OIC hold any significance with respect to the country's own individual relationship with other countries?
So I think this is an important question. I think both Farrukh and Faisal have made this point in different ways, that countries will eventually act on their interests, their own interest. Right? Countries, and that's how they should act. That is the world we are in. Countries want to advance their interests. When you have these large gatherings, when you have these organizations, the assumption is that there are some interests that are common across them. And that are so common across that grouping that those individual country interests and the common interest can come together. And that is where influence and power will come from. Right? So the assumption is, because these are Muslim countries, there are some interests that they share. And the trick and the magic of the host, in this case Pakistan, or the organization and the leadership of the organization, is to bring together those interests that are in fact common as well as individual. And that is why I think, for example, the issue of Islamophobia is an important one, because it is something that, anyone from any of these countries just traveling around the world confronts in some way. So they can individualize it. But then there are these bigger issues of world affairs. I think the mention was made about grain. If you are in Africa, the war in Ukraine is a possible food crisis.
It is.
If you are in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine is essentially an energy question.
Right.
Because what you have is a shifting energy landscape because of Russia and how much Europe depends on oil from it. If you are in Europe, and many of these countries are in fact around Europe, if not within Europe, also within Europe, then it is a question of where European politics is going. So what I'm trying to say is that with any of these things, the Afghanistan issue is a very good example again, that even if different countries come to the question from different directions, they bring a common interest for some of these issues. And if we can identify those and bring them together on that platform, that is where the shift happens. But
Dr. Najim, I'm glad that you're talking about the commonality of purpose here. The concern that I have is that especially this is true for South Asians, I'm sure that it goes for many other places as well, that people are so obsessed with politics that perhaps the other commonalities, for example, the economic activity and other concerns are overlooked. And I understand that there are many undercurrents which unite all these Muslim countries, because they have more or less the same post-colonial crisis or culture that might be impeding their progress. At this moment, today actually Foreign Minister of Pakistan also wrote an editorial And in that, he particularly talked about the need for innovation and economic development and economic progress as well. Last time we spoke, and there was this emergency CFM session in Islamabad. Remember, we talked about trust fund for Afghanistan. That was created back then, and you were very hopeful. But so far, we haven't seen much progress in that context. Do you think that these countries can work together to address essentially issues which are not economic, not political, but essentially economic or innovation-wise important, sir?
I don't know. I don't know if they can. I know that it will not be easy, but I also know that it is important. I think the trust fund example is a very good one, right? I was on with you on at that time, and there was an excitement about these Muslim countries coming together and talking about a trust fund and so on and so forth. And yet we saw it just diminish literally hours after the event. And that is why these activities have to continue, and the pressure has to continue to not only bring out words, but to bring out action. A lot of the other things we've talked about are similar. Right? You can have a lot of goodwill and even seeming consensus on ideas that falter at the point of policy. And they falter, I think, for the reason you mentioned. If you are talking about weak countries, weak whether they are economically or politically or internally or externally, that weakness will translate into them having less and less options to translate their words into actions, because they will be.
Just one second, Faisal. I just want to talk about something that he earlier mentioned as well with reference to commonalities, and understand that's important for the OIC to function or perhaps to move forward with some sort of progress. But do you think that perhaps the commonality is going to be so basic on a level, so basic in terms of ideas only, perhaps, or principles only, as you were earlier mentioning with regards to Islamophobia as well, that it's not really going to manifest itself in actual action or change or a solution that is required? What at max or at best that we can get is a stance or a condemnation or a statement, because the commonality itself will be existing on a level which is really basic. Professor Adil?
Right, it was for me. Thank you. No, I think that could be. Sometimes cooperation comes from trying to cooperate. What I mean by that is, if you have something to do together, you learn the habit of doing things together. And that is why, for example, the trust fund was such a good idea. I think one of the things that you always look for in meetings like this is, have they agreed to something that can actually be done? Because if they do, even if it is a small thing, if they do that thing together, it will create the habit of doing things together. It will create the momentum that comes from having seen yourself to cooperate on something.
But didn't the trust fund actually fail?
No, it hasn't failed, but it hasn't actually taken life of its own.
So
and that is the problem, sir. One metaphor comes to my mind, Pinocchio. Pinocchio wanted to be a real boy, and he had to actually go and look for, Blue Fairy. The problem is that this Pinocchio wants to be a real boy as well. Do you think that we can find that fairy somewhere, sir?
I hope so, yeah, we need to. Again, you ask those questions, I don't know if we can. I know it is difficult to do so. I know it is important to do so. But my point is the following. In some ways, if you set your goals so high and so unrealistic, that people, even when they are agreeing to those goals, know that nothing will happen.
Yeah, Professor
That
Adil
is less important than setting doable, bite-sized goals that you and I can work on together. Because once we do something together, then doing the next thing together becomes easier, because now we have the momentum and the winds behind our sails. So what I'm trying to get at is, I would much rather see smaller concrete steps coming out than grandiose big statements that we all sort of nod our head at, but no, will not be translated into action.
Yeah, Professor Adil, talking about pressure, while listening to the speech of President of Islamic Development Bank, he categorically highlighted that there is money which will be spent, which would be spending on female educations and colleges and schools for the female. So I just wanted to know, doesn't it seem like even the OIC has recognized that somewhere down the line they have to pressurize Taliban to come to terms with it, number one. And number two, that this kind of step forward by OIC would actually open a door for the other countries, non-OIC countries as well, to put money in this trust fund. And of course, when the fund is bigger, all of the humanitarian crisis can be countered and Taliban would come to terms with it, sir?
And third point, sir, just to be a bit selfish here, and let me pay a compliment as well. I know your work. Every time we speak, I feel that I'm more enriched and more informed. I keep on thinking about not only money, but brain trust that Muslim countries have. Like you also participated in that Nobel Prize winning project about environment. This intellectual, brain trust can work together to create more nuances and systems when it comes to these funds. Why is it that OIC keeps on talking about these things rather than inventing more procedures or solutions to actually relieve Muslims of their pain, sir?
Yeah, difficult question, and thank you for the compliment, though. Thank you very much. But difficult question. I do think that on Afghanistan, and in many ways, everyone now knows what the next steps are. Right? The next steps are, in many ways, pushing the Taliban to become more accommodating of both the international and the internal Afghan demand for education, for women's rights, and so on and so forth, and for the rest of the world to find ways to support that action and strengthen it. In many ways, I think, unfortunately, one of the things that's happened is that the recent events, and I mean Ukraine here, have totally distracted world attention from Afghanistan. Not that it was there was a lot before that, but it has just totally vanished. And that, I think, is a role that the OIC can play in highlighting it again. The other role is what you mentioned with the statement from the president of the Islamic Development Bank, that why can't these Muslim countries take some of that step itself, even if not at a full level, at some level. And again, focus on less about what the Taliban are doing and more about what can we do to make the lives of ordinary Afghan men and women better.
Right. Professor
Right?
Adil,
So
earlier
again,
you were talking about
smaller steps that can be done are superior to grandiose ideas that will not be done.
Sure. Professor Adil, earlier you were talking about realistic and bite-sized goals, and I understand that. With reference to the 48th session that is happening right now, what are those realistic outcomes that you expect from this, with reference to perhaps four major issues when you talk about Afghanistan, Islamophobia, Kashmir, and Palestine, or any other that you think is more important? With reference to each of these, what is that bite-sized outcome that you're looking for?
Sana, if I was that smart that I could tell you the bite-sized immediately, I would be in the conference session itself. But I think you've highlighted the right four issues. But I think the issues are right. I think I hope that the conference highlights again the importance of Afghanistan and the importance of the humanitarian issue in Afghanistan as a world responsibility. And that coming from Muslim countries, I think, has weight. On Islamophobia, I think it is a question of and that may be the place where you can have the greatest impact. With the UN resolution behind us, if we can create genuine interest within the Muslim countries to keep that issue alive, to keep it intellectually alive in the way that Farrukh, for example, was mentioning, because it will require that intellectual and policy input into what that means in practice. If even half of these foreign ministers go back from this conference with the same passion for that idea that I think we have talked about, then I would consider it to be a success. On Kashmir, I think for Pakistan in particular, but for Kashmiri people, and most importantly, that restatement, the reassertion of the importance of this very long-lasting conflict, of this very long-lasting injustice by the Muslim world will mean a lot. I hope the foreign ministers there realize that for the people of Kashmir, they have been fighting a most difficult battle. and nearly alone.
Right,
And
but
simply
and
that
Palestine is left.
statement
right,
of
Dr.
support
Zab,
which we got.
earlier when you were talking about this, you actually added a qualifier, if they go back. My question is regarding what we have seen in Kashmir. We have been fighting for Kashmiri rights for 73 years, 74 years, sir. But when I go to a J store or when I go to any international publication house, most of the books that are written on Kashmir are either written by foreigners or then Indians rather than Pakistanis and Kashmiris. So do you think that when it comes to Islamophobia, we are going to see serious initiative at all from Muslim countries, sir?
I don't know, but yeah, maybe that is a doable. That's the bite-sized thing I was talking about. I can imagine immediately for Islamic organizations or Muslim world organizations like the Islamic Development Bank, like ComSats, which is the commissions on science and technology, like the intellectual arms, like the universities in these countries, to take up your challenge. I think the challenge you throw is a very important one. Maybe this conference can come up and take your argument seriously and say, let us come up with an action plan, because this is doable. This is doable cost-wise as well as work-wise. To really put meaning into this concept,
Right.
to put meaning into what Islamophobia is, and to put meaning into what are the
And
steps
with regards
that
to
can be
Palestine,
taken.
sir, quickly, because we're out of time almost.
Palestine, I think, is the thorniest of that. I hope they will talk about Palestine. I hope even if it is in closed doors. Because again, if you think about the politics of that region itself, it is in a state of flux. There are
Professor
a number
Adil,
of countries represented here that are trying to recalibrate their own policy. And this group
Professor
needs to
Adil,
talk about.
Let him finish.
yeah, Professor Adil, unity against Islamophobia achieved. Can we achieve unity against proxies within Islamic world?
Sorry, come again on the last one.
Can we achieve unity against the proxy wars being fought within the Islamic world, sir? I'm talking about Yemen.
Yeah, but much more difficult, much more difficult. I'm so glad that you brought up Yemen. This is where we started this conversation, that a lot of the really biggest challenges are not between the Muslim world and the so-called non-Muslim world. They are within these Muslim countries. They are amongst these Muslim countries. And the first step has to be, whether it is Yemen, whether it is even Iraq and Syria and other parts of the world, whether it is Palestine, whether it is Kashmir, can these countries have the ability to speak with one voice? One voice doesn't mean they agree on everything, but one voice should mean at least that we agree on some big principles for what is the basis of unity. Otherwise, the only basis remains that countries represent people who were born Muslim. And that alone is not enough to create the type of momentum we are talking about.
Right, and that is very important, Dr. Zab, very quickly, because we are talking about Muslims all over the world, and earlier you were talking about Ukraine as well. One thing that I have to point out that we haven't heard, we have heard the desire to actually broach peace between Russia and Ukraine, but we haven't heard a lot about Muslims within Russia and Ukraine, which might be facing elements like Azov Brigade, neo-Nazis and similar kind of elements. So perhaps that could also be addressed. And secondly, I keep on listening to the podcast that you appear in. Can you actually ensure that there are more of it so that we can keep listening to that enlightening talk as well?
Certainly. Certainly. I one line on that, just not to respond, but to add. In some ways, one question that the OIC has always had is that it is an organization of countries with Muslim majority. But a lot of Muslims live in countries that do not have Muslim majority. India is an example. Yeah. The US is an example. If you think about the Muslim population within the EU, that is one of the largest Muslim populations anywhere.
Right.
So
unfortunately,
in
Professor
ways,
Adil, I'll have to cut you short here. We're out of time. Thank you so much. We'd love to talk more to you with reference to this and many other. I'm sure you'll have an opinion on everything. Thank you very much for being part of the debate. And hopefully we'll see you soon again some other time as well. Keep watching PTV World for a special transmission that continues on the OIC special session of the foreign ministers. We'll continue our discussion tomorrow as well in a special segment of 7 to 9 of the debate. So keep watching PTV World and don't miss us tomorrow at 7.